I just got the news that the Ukrainians have managed to blow up part of the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is by far the most significant development of the war to date. And I realize there's been a lot going on in Kiev and Kharkiv and Kherson and everything. All of that's important, but this is the potential game changer that the Ukrainians have been hoping for. The Kerch Bridge is the only large-scale rail connection between mainland Russia and the Crimean Peninsula, which is home to about 2.5 million people, most of whom consider themselves to be Russian citizens, and the bulk of Russian forces both in Crimea and in southwestern Ukraine. There are other rail connections in the Donbass, in Luhansk and Donetsk, but they do not really connect through to the southwest. The rail connections that are relevant go all the way up to the Dnieper. So in order to get rail from the eastern stretches of Ukraine to the southern, they have to basically go right by Russian positions, and those have been within range of artillery since the beginning of the war. You can guarantee that the Ukrainians are going to be targeting those extra closely now. Logistically, it is difficult to understate the criticality of this for the Russians. Russia doesn't have a road network. The money generated per acre of farmland is so low because it's all short season wheat that they've never built one. They've never been able to afford it. So if you want to move things at volume, you have to move them by rail. And with Kerch being the only real connection, it is the primary way that the Russians supply Crimea and the southwestern front with not just troops and equipment, but with food and fuel. And that's for the civilian population as well. That is now all in question. Now, the Ukrainians have been wanting to hit this bridge since the beginning, but they have not been able to prove to the Americans that they can get trained up or be trusted with the long-range rocket systems that would be necessary to target something that's so reinforced and so distant. So they went old school and used a truck bomb. At the moment, damage assessments are still being done, but it is obvious that one of the two major road spans has been dropped. That is not the sort of thing you fix without several months of work. And they timed the explosion to blow up a fuel train that was going through, so the whole thing's on fire. And simply the repair from that is going to be a minimum of a week, assuming it can be repaired at all. And now that the Ukrainians know it can be done, you can bet they're going to try to hit other parts of it to make sure the thing stays offline. Now, for the first time, we have a path forward for the Ukrainians here to win that is not long and windy. I've always been cautious about saying that Ukraine can win this because by the numbers they can't, especially with the mobilization and the Russians planning on throwing at least 500,000 troops into it. I mean, you throw 500,000 troops into anything, no matter how badly supplied they are, and you can move the boulder and make the situation very different. And that is how Russia has traditionally won all of its wars. But you don't throw 500,000 people at logistics. This is something where either you have the connections or you don't. And if we're talking about Russian troops in Zaporizhzhia and Kherson and Crimea suddenly being on their own, the Russians can only supply those three regions in two ways now. One is by truck. And we know that because of all the javelins that have been put into Ukraine and all the RPGs, that the Russians are almost out of their entire military tactical truck fleet, and they've started using city buses and Scooby-Doo vans. And those just can't take the volume of stuff that an active frontline needs, and they're certainly far more vulnerable to disruption. The second option is ships. You do have major ports at Novorossiysk on the Black Sea, but if we're now in a situation where Kerch can't supply things like anti-aircraft missiles, anti-ship missiles, food, it's very easy to see the Ukrainians being able to repeat the feat that they did earlier this summer when they sunk the flagship, the Moskva, and do that to every single cargo ship that the Russians try to bring in. Losing cargo ships in that volume, losing trucks and buses in that volume, is hollowing out the entirety of the Russian internal transport system. This is the sort of thing that if you bleed this fast, it takes a decade to recover from. And in a war zone, that is not going to happen, particularly since we're in an environment of sanctions where people are getting more and more skittish about selling the Russians anything.
We've got, I hesitate to call it a stalemate, that's not quite the right word, but the Russian advance in eastern and southern Ukraine is definitely stalled. And more weapon systems from the West are getting in, which are contributing to that. And the Ukrainians now have more people on the front line than the Russians do. I do expect a general Russian mobilization, and I do expect that to push the Ukrainians back and ultimately break their capacity. The limiting factor on both sides now is how quickly both sides can bring equipment into the war front. The West is starting to run low. The Ukrainians have definitely outperformed, and the Russians have absolutely underperformed. We saw a policy change in most of the Western capitals at the start of the third week of the war, when it became apparent that the Ukrainians actually might be able to hang in there. Everyone was kind of preparing for what would it mean when the Russians were on NATO's border, the entire frontier. This is going to sound a little depressing, but they're doing everything they can right now. They're learning the new weapon systems as quickly as they can. They're making it count. They've developed a fantastic human intelligence network in the occupied territories and even in Russia. I'm spitballing here because I don't know this for sure, but there are a lot of really suspicious fires at industrial military facilities throughout Western Russia, and have been for a month. The Russians, this may be nothing more than the fact that Western techs are gone, and the Russians are not really good at safety. But this is a lot of fires in a lot of places that are really sensitive. It feels like there's something else going on, and the Ukrainians are the ones who could pull that off. They're also destroying their own physical infrastructure to stymie Russian advances. And then if you add in the Excalibur rounds and the howitzers, they could start decapitating Russian forces. They're doing all of these things to a degree that I would have never guessed was possible 10 weeks ago when the war started. I don't think anybody was predicting this. I don't know if it's going to be enough, because once the Russians do a regular mobilization, and instead of 200,000 troops, they have 2 million troops in theater, that's a very different picture. The Russians have to get those gaps. One of them is Bessarabia, modern-day Moldova. One is the Polish Gap. You can guess where that one is. One is the Baltic Gap. That's Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So once the Russians are done with Ukraine, once it's pacified to their satisfaction, they will push on, and there will be a direct NATO-Russian confrontation. What we know now, though, is that the Russians are not all that when it comes to war. So if we have a direct NATO-Russian fight, the Russians are going to be beaten soundly about the head and shoulders, and they will be forced into a humiliating strategic retreat all the way back to Russia, maybe even past the borders. And since they see this as an issue of national survival, if we get into that environment, they will probably escalate, and they will probably bring nukes to the party. So it has become essential for NATO to make sure that the Russian army dies in Ukraine, and that's why we're sending everything that we can. I'm just not sure of how long we can keep it up. Canada and Germany have exhausted most of their stores, and nobody wants to exhaust their frontline equipment so that they don't have a military. And building out supply chains in peacetime for this sort of stuff has always been a hard carry. So like Raytheon can only produce about 2,000 Javelin missiles a year, and they think it's going to take them over a year to increase that to 4,000. Well, we've already shipped them 2,000 missiles. We're starting to run out. We're not there yet, and there are some new systems like the howitzers with the Excalibur rounds that are potentially game-changing. So I don't want to be overly pessimistic for the Ukrainians here.